Sounds all good.
Oh, good. You spotted it earlier.
There we are, there's the 100s. Right. Just wait for people to come in. Okay, hello everyone.
Gather round closer.
Stop number 2 on the journey. As Richard said, my name's Daniel, and I'm involved in the education and research stuff at London Mining Network, and most of work particularly around extractivism in Southern Africa as well. Where we're outside right now, 100 Victoria Street, is Serco's headquarters. Anyone ever heard of Serco before? No?
Yeah.
The kind of evasiveness of where they're kind of hidden in the 4th floor of this building kind of represents Serco as a company to a significant extent. It's a security company that has over 70 military contracts with the Ministry of Defence, and it owns about a quarter of the atomic weapons establishment which services Britain's nuclear arsenal. And that's about a stockpile of 215 nuclear weapons which are costing 205 billion over the programme of operation. And when we were doing the research for the Marshall Mining Report, which is on a QR codes that I think was sent round as well, we figured that that whole nuclear arsenal which Britain is building at the moment weighs almost 70,000 tonnes of material with 170 kilometres of pipes, 52,000 electrical items, 1,500 kilometres of cables and 16 Trident missiles with 48 warheads. And we obviously, as part of the Marshall Mining Report, wanted to materialise these military infrastructures, that nuclear weapons and tanks and bombs and missiles and drones don't just suddenly materialise out of nowhere. The base of those infrastructures comes from mining affected communities where the resources like cobalt or uranium for nuclear weapons is coming from. So Serco is profiting at least a quarter of that 205 billion pounds that is going to servicing Britain's nuclear arsenal. But they're also involved in a huge number of other very nefarious and evil acts around the world. So that includes running adult prisons, 11 Australian immigration detention centres, where they have some of the most abhorrent practices of treating refugees and asylum seekers, as well as running Yarl's Woods detention centre here in the UK, which has been repeatedly found guilty of extreme neglect and violence and abuse of refugees and asylum seekers detained here on British soil. They also happen to have quite a famous or high-profile CEO called Nicholas Soames, who's not only a Tory Member of Parliament, he's also the grandson of Winston Churchill, and was paid a healthy £4 million for his role as CEO of the company. But one of the main things for London mining context in terms of why we're interested in these private security companies is because oftentimes companies like Serco or companies like G4S and Aegis, who are other British security companies, explicitly target the natural resources sector for their profit making. And as we know, mining operations, when communities are being displaced from their land, when their land and their soils and the air and the water is being contaminated and polluted, there's a lot of resistance. So companies like Serco or G4S are brought in oftentimes to deal with that resistance in a coercive way, in a violent way. So that might go from repression to intimidation, surveillance, harassment, but as well as forced disappearances, invasions and assassinations. We know that London's mining giants that we're going to be going to and learning about today are involved in at least 83 cases of conflict surrounding extractive operations, and that's according to the Environmental Justice Atlas. So we have companies like G4S that explicitly target the natural resource sector, be that in Iraq or Afghanistan, but also in Somalia and in Yemen, and how this is also connected to the fact that on average every week 4 land and environmental defenders are murdered in the course of protecting the earth, in the course of protecting nature and their rivers and soils and lands. And we learn about the names of Berta Cáceres, of Fikili and Tshange and Okazuka Radebe, who are communities that we've worked with in Southern Africa, and Berta Cáceres, of course, in Honduras. So that's how a company like Serco here in the centre of London is not just connected to the nuclear weapons industry, to immigration detention centres. They also got a healthy share of the 100 billion that went to COVID contracts as well. So this is a company that is involved and has its finger in all of these pies and is accumulating huge vast sums of money in the process, and the way in which they are entangled in the mining industry is just one of those. Are you ready to move on to the next one? Unless any questions about Serco? Yeah? So I wouldn't be able to answer that specifically about Serco, whether they're currently responsible for sort of forced displacements or forced assassinations of environmental land defenders. Yeah, I mean, well, the sort of powerful forces like Serco do work in that very sort of dissipated way. The power doesn't just come from the force of disappearances or from assassinations, also the role that they perform in surveillance and in intimidation and harassment and just general, what we might call sort of corporate counterinsurgency. So rather than bringing in the army or the military to evict people from their lands, you might have mining companies deciding to build a small hospital or sponsor a football team in the area, and ways in which sort of hearts and minds become integral to the operation of the mining company and industry in order to oftentimes divide communities and to sort of stop the resistance from gaining the kind of coherence and organisation that's going to be able to overthrow the mining company that's polluting their land, their water, and all of those other things we've already mentioned. So companies like Serco do very much spread that line between very much coercive power, military and security force, as well as the kind of hearts and minds, surveillance, intimidation that goes into dividing communities from their resistance. That answer? Yeah. Yeah.
How you go about connecting the dots and doing the research, because like most of these companies, they're operating with so many kind of subsidiary groups, and also and maybe a little bit of insight into how the research happens to produce this kind of it's always going to be an incomplete picture, a kind of bigger picture of these sort of really kind of the various entanglements.
So they're Corporate Watch is a member of the London Mining Network, and they have a really good sort of do-it-yourself how to investigate like a company. So how to sort of pass through the annual reports that companies provide. And oftentimes these answers are there in plain sight, but they're just expecting that we're too exhausted in our daily lives because of the pressures of capitalism and everything else, that we're going to have time to read through a 300-page report about what Serco is doing and how it's making its money. But oftentimes they are publishing a lot of this information, and if they're not, there are freedom of information requests that you can send to the government, and they have some forms of like public duty to respond to the extent to which they're having meetings or that they are lobbying other governments on behalf of these mining companies or on behalf of Serco. So things I would definitely recommend if you're interested in kind of research about companies, using that Corporate Watch like guides, because it's a lot to get into or to jump into straight away. And once you Google is your friend, but it can also be your enemy because of the algorithms, and a lot of the time companies are spending a lot of money to make sure that positive news kind of filters to the top that is sort of happening about it. But a lot, just digging, finding the information, to use like the mining metaphor, like once you start sort of digging and start tracing the money, you will find lots of stuff that comes out of it. A lot of that stuff is hidden in plain sight, but oftentimes it takes time. And it's great to be able to do it like collectively with other people, knowing that that information is not just going to sort of escape into the ether, but that it can actually tangibly support struggles of communities who are resisting these companies on the ground. There was another, did you want, yeah? Yeah. Yeah. They're limited, and I mean, what we've seen with the COVID contracts, there is a lot of what they do, corruption in other countries, but is often called sleeves here. That kind of means that these companies are often don't receive the kind of scrutiny or accountability that they ought to. And Britain is very consistently opposed in international forums the banning of like mercenary armies or the employing of them, because Britain and British companies obviously benefit from that in lots of parts of the world. So on an international scale, the kind of intricacies of international law is definitely something that I would defer to other people about, and I don't know. But what we do know is that these companies are very, very rarely held to account for any of their kind of nefarious practices, and oftentimes what they're doing to us might seem like heinous and violent and awful, but it's perfectly legal. Those are legalized industries of theft, of brutality, and they're only ever held to account when there's a organized power of people that are going to keep on fighting to make sure that there is justice or reparations in whichever kind of specific struggle that we're talking about. Yeah.